Recently, a new acquaintance from Hong Kong wrote to ask me about celestial connections in the scriptures of what are commonly known as the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. Specifically, he was interested in certain passages in the scroll of the prophet Ezekiel. He had already seen this previous video about the famous vision of Ezekiel, which involves the likeness of 4 living creatures and of wheels lifted up from the earth. And he wanted to ask about some other passages. Among those passages was the passage in Ezekiel chapter 4 involving a siege that the prophet is instructed to make, in which he's to take a tile and an iron pan and portray upon it the city Jerusalem and lay a siege against it and cast a mount against it and set rams around it and lie upon his left side for 390 days and then on his right side for 40 days. Based on some videos he had seen regarding the impact of the cycles of the heavens upon the movement of the stock market, including the impact of the movements of planets upon markets, my friend from Hong Kong suggested that the number 390 days might have something to do with half of the synodal cycle of the planet Mars. This is very intriguing because it reminded me of a discussion that I published several years ago involving a passage found in the ancient text of the Iliad, recounting some of the sacred myths of ancient Greece, specifically a passage describing the time when the war god Ares was imprisoned in a brazen jar for 13 months. This would be an important connection between a passage in the ancient scriptures of the Bible and a passage in the epics of ancient Greece involving the heavenly cycles of the constellations and the motions of the visible planets through those constellations. I have already published 2 separate books, Star Myths of the World, volumes 2 and 3, each of them with over 700 pages and each of them containing over 250 illustrations and star charts, which show that the Greek myths and the stories and characters in the Bible are built on a common system of celestial metaphor. And in those books, the first of which is all about the star myths in Greek mythology, and the second of which is all about the star myths of the Bible, I've already touched upon clear connections between the events described in the Odyssey and episodes in the gospel stories of what is commonly called the New Testament. For instance, there is a baptism scene in the Odyssey involving the descent of a goddess in the form of a bird when Odysseus must plunge into the ocean. And there's a very significant foot washing scene in the Odyssey, just as there's a foot washing scene during the Last Supper, as described in the gospel accounts. Also, there are references to a figure carrying a winnowing fan on his shoulder in both the Odyssey and in the gospel accounts. And I would argue that in all of these parallels we can see that the passages in both the Odyssey and in the gospel stories are based upon the very same constellations in the night sky, which is why the stories parallel each other so closely. A connection between a passage in the Iliad and the ancient book of the prophet Ezekiel would therefore be another piece of evidence which shows that the world's ancient myths, including the stories in what we refer to as the Bible, are speaking a celestial language and that they are in fact based upon a common system, the same system which can be found to be operating all around the world in the sacred stories of virtually every culture on every inhabited continent and island, from Australia to Africa to Asia to Europe to the Americas and across the vast Pacific. In Book 5 of the Iliad, we find an account of the time when 2 giant sons of Ilias, the giant brothers Ephialtes and Otis, imprisoned the god Ares inside of a brazen jar. This story is related or recounted to the love goddess Aphrodite by her mother Dione, when Aphrodite is wounded in battle by Diomedes. She was on the battlefield to rescue her son Aeneas, who fights for the Trojans, from Diomedes, who had wounded him in the joint where the hip bone turns inside the socket of the pelvis, which is the very same place that Jacob is wounded in the Genesis account in Genesis 32 at the ford of Jabbok. While she is saving Aeneas, Diomedes spears Aphrodite in the wrist, and she flees the battlefield and finds her brother Ares and asks him for his chariot and horses to take her back to Olympus, where she is comforted by her mother, the goddess Dione, who tells Aphrodite that many gods have been wounded by mortals. Dione says, beginning in line 431 of the Iliad, Book 5, "Patience, O my child, bear up now, despite your heartsick grief. How many gods who hold the halls of Olympus have had to endure such wounds from mortal men whenever we try to cause each other pain? Ares had to endure it, when giant Ephialtes and Otis, sons of Ilias, bound him in chains he could not burst, trussed him up in a brazen cauldron 13 months. And, despite the gods' undying lust for battle, Ares might have wasted away there on the spot if the monster's stepmother, beautiful Arabia, had not sent for Hermes, and out of the cauldron Hermes stole him away, the war god breathing his last, all but broken down by the ruthless iron chains." In a previous video and blog post from 2013 and 2014, I explained that there is sufficient evidence to argue that this story probably involves the zodiac constellation Aquarius, the water bearer, who carries a jug or jar of water or a water vessel, which could play the role of the jar or vessel in which Ares was imprisoned, especially because the path of the planets Mars and Mercury, which are the Latin or Roman names for the gods Ares and Hermes from the Iliad account, can be seen to pass through that jar held by Aquarius. Here's a video I made showing the passage of the sun and the visible planets through the constellations of the zodiac as seen from an observer on Earth as we go through the year. The video shows the sun's position at noon each day, which will be higher in the sky during the summer months, leading up to its highest point at summer solstice, and lower in the sky during the winter months, leading down to its lowest point at winter solstice. Note that the sun's path travels through Aquarius shortly after reaching the low point of the winter solstice, and that the giants Otis and Ephialtes are described in other Greek myths recounted by other ancient authors as trying to climb up to Olympus and challenge the gods for supremacy, just as Aquarius is a figure who is found on that upward climb towards the upper half of the year. Here's a view showing the motions of the planets Mercury and Mars in the early part of the year 2013, when Mars actually appeared lower in the sky than Mercury, which is a somewhat rare occurrence, and which I suggested at the time might correspond to a myth in which Hermes somehow assumes a superior position to Ares, such as the story in which Hermes rescues Ares from the brazen jar in which the giants Otis and Ephialtes had imprisoned the war god. Mercury, of course, is an interior planet, meaning that its orbit around the sun is inside of the orbit of the Earth around the sun. And that means that we always have to look towards the sun in order to see Mercury. Because Mercury orbits so close to the sun, we have to look pretty close to the sun to see it. Mercury stays closer to the sun than does Venus, the other interior planet. Therefore, we only see Mercury right before the sun comes up or right after the sun is set. Mars, on the other hand, is an exterior planet to Earth, orbiting outside of our orbit around the sun, which means that it can range across the entire night sky. There are times on its orbit that it will cross the center of our night sky, being visible even at midnight, unlike the interior planets, which are only seen relatively close to the sun, leading the sun before sunrise or following the sun after sunset. However, as we just saw, there are times when Mars will be seen to actually be below Mercury in the sky, closer to the horizon than Mercury is. Here's how that works. Here's a view of the planets out to Mars as they were arranged in early 2013. Starting from the Sun, we see the paths of Mercury, then Venus, then Earth, then Mars. We're looking down on the solar system from this view, such that we're looking down on Earth's North Pole, which means that Earth's daily rotation on its axis will appear counterclockwise from our vantage point. I've added an image of Earth on the left of the screen looking down on our planet towards the North Pole. Those thin yellow lines represent the field of view for an observer on the western edge of North America, here in California where I am, with the upper arrow representing the eastern horizon and the lower arrow representing the western horizon. That field of view will, of course, vary depending on whether you have mountains or hills on your horizon, the width of the view of the sky that you can see. As Earth turns on its axis towards the east, the sun will eventually crest above that eastern horizon line. Earth's rotation exposes the sun to our field of view when that upper arrow representing the eastern horizon rotates around enough to bring the sun into our field of view. As Earth continues to rotate on its axis here, its rotation will bring both Mercury and Mars into our field of view, but of course our observer won't be able to see them during the day because the sun is also in that field of view, drowning out all the stars and planets with its light. However, as we continue to rotate on the axis, turning towards the east, eventually that other limit of our field of view, the trailing arrow representing the western horizon, will come into contact with the sun, which is when we observe a sunset as the sun sinks behind the western horizon due to our Earth's spinning. Now, as the sun's glow fades from the sky, we can catch a glimpse of the planets in the darkening western sky. In this case, we see that Mars and Mercury are both above the western horizon after the sun has set. Here's Mercury on the inmost orbital path closest to the sun. Our observer can now see both Mercury and Mars just after sunset. Note that they are roughly in alignment on the 9th of February from 2013, but as days go by and the Earth continues on its orbit around the sun, they're going to separate. Here we move forward to the 10th of February, and now you can see that Mercury is going to begin to be slightly higher in the sky above the western horizon than is Mars, which is slightly closer to the western horizon, represented by that yellow line to the right of Mars on the screen. And as the Earth continues to progress, Mercury will get even a little further above Mars in the sky. Here we are on the 11th, then the 12th, and as we get to the 13th of February, Mars is well below Mercury. Note that this is all due to the relative positioning of the planets on their orbital path based on an observer on Earth at the point of our daily rotation, just after sunset. That's what caused Mercury to seem to be slightly above Mars in the night sky in February 2013, and specifically, as we just saw, in the water vessel or jar carried by Aquarius. Here once again is how that planetary motion appears from the perspective of an observer on Earth. And there are a number of clues in the ancient accounts of this myth which help to confirm that the giants who imprisoned Ares are indeed associated with the figure of Aquarius. First, as already mentioned, they put him in a jar, and Aquarius is of course notable for carrying a jar or a jug. Also, as noted previously, Aquarius is located in the annual cycle on the upside of the lowest point of the year, and the giants Otis and Ephialtes are described as trying to climb up to Olympus to challenge the deathless gods. Further, there are other ancient authors who also talk about the story of Otis and Ephialtes and in some accounts the two giants meet their end when the goddess Artemis took on the form of a stag and ran between them. And as they each tried to spear the animal, or the goddess in the form of a stag, they accidentally speared one another instead. And if you look at the outline of the constellation Aquarius, you can see that the forward leg of the figure can be envisioned as a spear, which is why figures who are associated with the constellation Aquarius often meet their end by being speared. I have found abundant evidence that the wounds described in the Iliad can be shown to correspond to specific constellations, and that we can actually predict the type of wound a character in the Iliad will receive if we can determine with which constellation that character is associated. And that's a pattern which holds true for wounds received by both gods and mortals in the Iliad. I discussed this pattern at length in Star Myths of the World, Volume 2, in the chapters which examine the Iliad. But the amazing thing about the ancient myths is that they can operate on multiple levels at once. Not only does this particular myth have a clear constellational component, but as we've just seen, it also incorporates the motions of the planets. In this case, the planets Mars and Mercury. And as we saw from the quoted text in the Iliad, the ancient texts actually specify that the war god Ares was imprisoned in the jar by the giants for 13 months. As I noted in a discussion of this myth in a blog post back in 2013, this detail in the text of the Iliad describing the imprisonment of Ares is astronomically significant because 13 months is half of the synodal cycle of the planet Mars, and it happens that the planet Mars grows dimmer from the perspective of an observer on Earth for half of its synodic cycle, 13 months, and then grows brighter for 13 months. The synodal period is the period of time that it takes for planets to meet together or align, and it's called a synod or a meeting. And it's interesting that the same word synod is used in the Christian tradition for a gathering of leaders of a church, which would seem to indicate historical awareness down through the centuries of the connection between church matters and celestial matters. So, although it varies slightly, Earth and Mars have a meeting in the heavens every 24 to 26 months, and half of that period is encoded with the reference to 13 months. And in the case of the Iliad, the reference to the war god Ares in his dim and weakened condition after 13 months of being in the jar. The average synodal period for Mars and Earth is 25.6 months. Well, it varies, like I said, but the average is 25.6 months, and that can be rounded up to 26 months and then encoded as such in myth. That's very similar to the way that the precessional constant of 71.6 years is rounded up to 72 when it is encoded in ancient mythology, including in the account of Osiris and Set from ancient Egypt. So this brings us to the passage in the ancient scroll of Ezekiel in the Hebrew scriptures, in which we see that the prophet is being instructed to lie on his right side for 390 days and then on his left side for 40 days. In the Iliad, we saw that Ares was imprisoned for 13 months, and if you multiply a 30-day month times 13, you'll see that the product of 13 times 30 is 390 days. So, as my friend from Hong Kong pointed out, this passage in Ezekiel also appears to be referencing half of the synodal period of the planet Mars. Before going any further, we should pause to consider that this is a very important parallel between two ancient texts which conventional scholars do not generally see as connected at all, but we can see it in black and white, so to speak, in the very texts of the Iliad and of the prophet Ezekiel, both of which contain written references corresponding to half of the synodal period of Mars. When the Earth speeds past Mars on its orbit, after having a synod or meeting along their two orbits, Mars will appear to go retrograde or exhibit retrograde motion against the backdrop of stars as Earth approaches to pass Mars and passes up Mars, which means that on successive nights, instead of moving eastward through the zodiac signs, the planet will move in the other direction towards the west on successive nights. This effect is as seen from an observer on Earth. It's very much the same phenomenon as seeing a car that you're passing on the freeway appearing to move backwards towards the rear of your car, even though you're both going forward in the same direction. If the freeway were actually a circular racetrack, then you would see cars in other lanes moving in the same direction as you against the backdrop of the grandstands. But when you passed a car in another lane, it would temporarily seem to move backwards against the backdrop of the stands. You can see that phenomenon taking place in this orbital diagram from inthesky.org, showing the planets in 2014 with Earth's position on our orbit catching up to Mars and then passing Mars. And if you watch along the top of the diagram, which shows the perspective for an observer on Earth looking out towards the zodiac band, you can see Mars moving eastward each night until Earth starts to pass along the inside orbit path, at which point Mars starts moving retrograde back to the west, or the right on this screen as you look at it, before turning back eastward again. Mars goes retrograde when Earth approaches that synod or meeting with Mars every 24 to 26 months, and that retrograde motion lasts for approximately 72 to 74 days. The same website that discusses the command to Ezekiel to lie on his left side for 390 days and on his right side for 40 days suggests that the 40 days might correspond to half of the period of time that Mars is seen to be in retrograde every 26 months, just as 390 days or 13 months corresponds to half of the total synodal cycle of Mars and Earth. But that may not be the correct explanation, since the duration of the apparent retrograde motion of Mars only lasts for about 74 days, not for 80 days. Although it is possible that the text is referencing that retrograde period and rounding that period up to 80 before dividing it in half, but I'd be cautious about concluding that that is certain. It's not a certain interpretation. One part of the text that may suggest that the passage is referencing the retrograde period is found in chapter 4, verse 8, where Ezekiel is told that he shall not turn himself from one side to the other until he has ended the 390 days of his siege. So that would mean don't turn back until the 390-day period is over. So maybe it's talking about the retrograde motion after that. It is worth noting that the Ezekiel passage may be referencing Aquarius when it tells Ezekiel to take a tile and make on it the depiction of Jerusalem and lay siege against it and cast a mount against it. The figure of the great square of Pegasus plays the role of a city in many ancient myths, including in the Gilgamesh epic, as I discuss in Star Myths of the World, Volume 1, and the city of Troy in the Iliad, as I discuss in Star Myths, Volume 2. And it may be that the tile referenced in Ezekiel 4, verse 2, is the great square of Pegasus, especially because Ezekiel is instructed to lay siege to it and cast a mount against it, which may be, based on my experience with other myths, it may indicate something to do with the constellation Pisces, which surrounds the square of Pegasus on two sides, just like a trench in a siege, and this mound-shaped constellation Cetus, the whale, nearby, which is probably the mount that Ezekiel is instructed to cast against the city, or the tile. And also note that Aquarius is close in the sky to the square of Pegasus, and that In Ezekiel 4 verse 3, Ezekiel is instructed to take an iron pan between him and the city. And that could be a reference to that same outline that Aquarius is carrying, normally envisioned as his water vessel, but maybe that's the iron pan. The prophet is also instructed in that same verse to, quote, set his face, or set thy face, against the city, just as Aquarius is seen to face the great square. Further, based on the direction that Aquarius is facing in the sky, that constellation could be envisioned as presenting his left side towards us, the viewers. However, I don't believe there are enough clues to say for absolute certain that the text in Ezekiel 4 is referencing Aquarius. There are enough clues in the Greek myths about Otis and Ephialtes and the imprisonment of Ares to be confident that we're talking about Aquarius, but not necessarily enough clues in the Ezekiel passage. However, there are enough clues to suggest the possibility in the Ezekiel passage. Another possibility is that lying on the side refers to the constellation Virgo, the Virgin. In the Ezekiel passage, the prophet is instructed to uncover his arm in Ezekiel 4 and verse 7, and an uncovered arm is a distinctive aspect of the outline of the constellation Virgo. And you can see in this depiction here of the siege of Ezekiel that the outline of the prophet himself matches right up with the outline of the constellation Virgo. And we also have a figure who looks like the constellation Boötes in about the proper relationship to the constellation Virgo. And we even have a figure holding a whisk or fan of peacock feathers, and that represents the outline of the constellation Coma Berenices, which is found in the heavens just above Virgo in the night sky. The important thing to note is that the two passages are almost certainly referencing the synodal period of the planet Mars in relation to observers on Earth. I believe that it's very likely that the story related in the text of the Iliad and that contained in the scroll of Ezekiel are both descended from some extremely ancient body of wisdom, which encodes the motions and cycles of the sun, moon, visible planets and stars in relation to observers on Earth, and that this ancient body of wisdom preserves a deep understanding of the impacts of different planetary alignments on events in what we think of as the ordinary material realm which we inhabit. I've previously written a blog post entitled "The Gods Are Real," which discusses some of the arguments presented in a 2010 book by Joseph Farrell entitled "Babylon's Banksters," in which he references a paper published in 1951 by J.H. Nelson of the engineering department of the RCA Communications Company, detailing astonishing correlations between the scientifically measured behavior and propagation of shortwave radio transmissions over the North Atlantic and the relative positions of planets in the solar system. Nelson found that when the planets Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn have alignments or groupings at angles of 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, or 270 degrees, disturbances are seen in the propagation of shortwave radio transmissions on Earth. This evidence suggests that the alignments of the planets have impacts which are not fully understood by conventional science and conventional physics. But, based on other research and other evidence observed in different fields over long periods of time, including in the field of economics, it's my understanding of Joseph Farrell's analysis in that book that Joseph Farrell is suggesting that the positions of the planets may relate to realities that are beyond the dimensions of what we ordinarily understand to constitute our physical reality, and that the ancient wisdom contained in the world's myths and scriptures appear to show an awareness of the potential impact of these hyperdimensional realities. And that may be why the Iliad and the book of Ezekiel are both apparently making specific references regarding the cycle of the planet Mars as it relates to the Earth. The ancient myths and scriptures also appear to warn that this knowledge and understanding of the impact of other realms beyond this ordinary realm, this knowledge of that impact is supposed to be used for the benefit of others, rather than for the personal accumulation of wealth or power. In many different myth systems, including in the stories contained in the Bible, we see versions of a story in which a king or a prince is offered a choice between wisdom, wealth, power over adversaries, etc. We see this in the episode of the Judgment of Paris in ancient Greece, also in the choice that's offered to King Midas in ancient Greek myth, and in the Bible, King Solomon is offered a choice in 1 Kings chapter 3, and he chooses to ask for wisdom in order to help the people. And the text says that this choice pleased the Almighty, who told Solomon that he is pleased that Solomon did not ask for riches, or for long life, or for power over his enemies. From the prevalence of these stories in ancient myth, I conclude that the ancient wisdom is telling us that this knowledge of the power of the unseen realm and its impact on what we think of as our ordinary reality is not supposed to be used for accumulating riches or for exercising power over one's enemies, but that it is supposed to be used for the cause of wisdom, specifically in order to help others and to promote the good of society. To conclude, I'm grateful to my new acquaintance from Hong Kong for asking this specific question about some of the other aspects of the text of the book of Ezekiel, just as I'm grateful for all the interaction and feedback and insights and questions that I receive from those who have contacted me over the years. I believe these myths belong to all of humanity and believe that we should all be consulting the ancient wisdom and asking questions of the myths, so to speak, because I believe that the ancient myths will often answer our questions. I believe that this connection between a passage in Ezekiel and a passage in the Iliad is significant, and I believe that it points towards the profound wisdom that is contained in the ancient myths, scriptures, and sacred stories preserved in cultures around the globe. I am convinced that these myths are all based upon a common, extremely ancient system of celestial metaphor encoding the motions of the heavenly cycles seen in the sun, the moon, the visible planets, and the stars and constellations. And I'm convinced that they are intended to convey profound truths for our benefit and blessing, and for helping others and promoting the good of society as a whole.